How long have you been starting tomorrow? Not days, not weeks. Be honest with yourself right now. How many months have you been waking up and telling yourself, today is the day? Today I start. Today is different. And then today becomes tonight, and tonight becomes tomorrow, and tomorrow becomes next Monday, and next Monday becomes next month. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, quietly, without a formal announcement, you stopped calling it a plan and started calling it just the way things are. The thing is, you are not lazy. You are not broken. You are not someone who just cannot get it together. Your brain is doing something very specific, something extraordinarily predictable, something that has a name, a mechanism, a documented neurological explanation. And the moment you understand what it is, you will never look at your own hesitation the same way again.
Most of us spend our entire lives inside what you might call a Murphy mindset. You have heard of Murphy's Law. If something can go wrong, it will go wrong. We plan for the worst before we even begin. We protect ourselves from disappointment by never fully committing. We call ourselves realistic. We call ourselves practical. We say we are just being smart about things. But what we are actually doing, what the neuroscience shows us we are actually doing, is handing our brain a filter. A specific, powerful, life-shaping filter that tells it exactly what to look for in every room it walks into, every opportunity it encounters, every moment it has to decide whether to start or stay still. But there is another law, one that works in exactly the opposite direction. And the people who seem to move through life with an almost unreasonable confidence that things will work out, the ones who start when they are not ready, who try again after they fail, who somehow find opportunity in situations that look identical to the ones that paralyze everyone else. They are not just lucky. Their brains are wired differently. And by the time this video is over, you will understand exactly how that wiring works. And more importantly, how to build it yourself. So before we go any further, let's understand these two laws, because once you see how they work, everything else in this video starts to make a lot more sense. Murphy's Law was coined in 1949 by an American aerospace engineer named Edward Murphy. The original statement was simple and specific. If there is any way for something to go wrong, it will go wrong. It was originally intended as a reminder to engineers to design systems that account for every possible failure point. But somewhere along the way, it escaped the engineering lab and entered the human psyche. And it did not arrive as a design principle. It arrived as a worldview, a way of moving through life with your guard permanently up, expecting the worst, preparing for disappointment, treating optimism as naivety and caution as intelligence. And for many people, maybe for you, it is not even a conscious choice. It is just the lens through which life has been experienced for so long that it feels like reality itself. Now, take Murphy's Law and spell Murphy backwards. Yhprum. Yhprum. Yhprum's law is the exact reverse of Murphy's Law. And its formula is equally simple. Everything that can work will work. Not as wishful thinking, not as a spiritual belief, not as toxic positivity that ignores the genuine difficulty of real life, as a documented psychological and neurological principle that describes what happens to the human brain, specifically, measurably, scientifically, when it operates from a framework of possibility rather than a framework of threat. And specifically what we are talking about today is Yhprum's law of action, the observation that everything that can work will work, and it shows up the moment you start moving. The key word there is moving. Yhprum's law does not activate in your head. It does not activate in your planning. It does not activate in your intentions or your vision boards or your journal entries about who you want to become. It activates in your feet, in the step you take. And the neuroscience of why that is true and why most people never take that step is what this entire video is about.
In 1967, a psychologist named Martin Seligman was conducting experiments at the University of Pennsylvania that would permanently change how we understand human motivation. He placed dogs into a two-compartment box with a low divider between the compartments. One side of the floor was electrified. The dog could escape simply by jumping the divider to the other side. And they did, every time. They learned quickly. Discomfort here, safety there. Jump.
But then he introduced a different condition. A second group of dogs were placed in a situation where the discomfort could not be escaped. No matter what they did, no matter how they moved or tried, the outcome was the same. Effort changed nothing. And then, after repeated exposure to that inescapable situation, he placed those same dogs into the original box, the one that was genuinely escapable, the one where jumping the divider would immediately end the discomfort. The dogs did not jump. They simply lay down and accepted the discomfort. Even though escape was right there, even though everything had changed and effort would now absolutely work, their brains had concluded from experience that effort was pointless. Seligman called this learned helplessness, and here is why it matters for you. Your brain did the same thing.
Not with electric shocks, but with the last time you tried something and it hurt. The last time you invested effort and hope and it did not work out. Your brain filed that experience and drew a conclusion. Starting is dangerous. Trying costs more than not trying. Staying still is safer than moving. And it has been protecting you from the danger of trying ever since. That is not laziness. That is not weakness. That is a compassionate, intelligent, deeply misguided act of self-protection. And the exit, just like the divider in Seligman's box, has been right there the whole time. Now, here is what learned helplessness does to your brain's filter. And this is where the neuroscience gets genuinely important. Your brain processes approximately 11 million bits of sensory information every single second. Your conscious mind can process roughly 50 of them. 50! Something has to decide which 50 make the cut, and that something is a brainstem network called the reticular activating system, the RAS. It acts as the gatekeeper between the world outside and the reality you actually experience. And here is the critical thing about the RAS. It does not choose randomly. It filters for what it has been trained to notice, and it was trained by your history. Someone whose brain has learned that effort leads to pain, whose filter has been shaped by repeated disappointment, walks into every new situation already scanning for evidence that it probably will not work, for the closed doors, for the reasons to stay still. And it finds that evidence every single day. Not because that is the only evidence available, because that is what the filter is looking for. The person running on Murphy's Law and the person running on Yhprum's Law can walk into exactly the same room and see a completely different reality. Not because the room is different, because their filters are different. Your brain is not showing you reality. It is showing you a filtered version of reality, built entirely from your past. The question is, can that filter be rebuilt? And the answer, which is where Yhprum's Law finally enters the neuroscience, is yes. In 1998, a psychologist named Barbara Fredrickson published a paper that would permanently change how scientists understand the function of positive emotions. The paper was called "What Good Are Positive Emotions?" And the question was genuine, because at that point in the history of psychology, the vast majority of research had focused on negative emotions. Fear, anger, grief, anxiety, these had clear evolutionary functions. They narrowed your focus, mobilized your body, and directed your attention toward a specific threat that needed to be dealt with. But what did positive emotions actually do, beyond making you feel good? Fredrickson's broaden and build theory showed that positive emotions have a broadening effect on your momentary thought-action repertoire. While negative emotions narrow your focus to the immediate threat, positive emotions do the opposite.
They expand your awareness, open your thinking, and increase your ability to notice possibilities you would not otherwise see. Over time, this broadened behavioral range builds useful skills and personal resources: physical, intellectual, social, and psychological. And crucially, the resources gained through positive emotions outlive the emotions from which they were acquired. They build up over time and increase overall well-being, which leads to more positive emotions, which leads to higher resilience, which leads to increased well-being. A genuine upward spiral. Now, connect that to the reticular activating system. When your brain is operating from a state of positive expectation, when it genuinely believes, even tentatively, that things might work out, your RAS shifts its filter. It begins noticing the 50 bits per second that align with possibility rather than threat. The same room that looked full of obstacles to the Murphy brain now contains visible openings to the Yhprum brain. Not because the room changed, because the filter changed. And here is where Seligman's work on learned optimism becomes directly relevant to you.
Learned optimism, the direct antidote to learned helplessness, is not a personality trait you were or were not born with. It is a trainable explanatory style. People who practice learned optimism explain negative events differently, as temporary rather than permanent, specific rather than global, and external rather than exclusively internal. This shift in explanatory style measurably changes outcomes across career, relationships, health, and performance. In plain language, the story you tell yourself about why things did not work last time is not fixed. It is a learned pattern, and learned patterns can be unlearned and replaced with something that serves you better. The pessimist who fails says, "I always fail. Everything goes wrong for me. I am just not someone things work out for."
The person practicing learned optimism, who experienced the exact same failure, says, that specific approach did not work in that specific situation at that specific time. That is useful information. It does not mean the next attempt will fail. One of those explanations keeps you lying on the floor of the shuttle box long after the exit is available. The other one gets you on your feet.
Here is something that Newton understood about the physical world that applies with equal precision to the human brain. An object at rest tends to stay at rest. An object in motion tends to stay in motion. This is not a metaphor. This is not an inspirational reframing of a physics principle for motivational purposes. It is a direct description of what happens neurologically when a human being who has been stuck finally takes the first step. The first step is always the hardest. Not because the task itself is hardest at the beginning, but because the first step has to overcome the full weight of inertia, the learned helplessness, the Murphy filter, the neural pathway that says effort leads to pain. Every step after the first one is easier, because motion builds momentum.
And momentum, neurologically, is a real thing.
When you take the first step towards something your brain has been resisting, several things happen simultaneously. Dopamine begins to release, not as a reward for completing the task, but in anticipation of what the action might lead to. That dopamine fuels the next action, which fuels more dopamine, which fuels more action. Your RAS, now receiving evidence that you are moving, begins filtering for information relevant to the direction you are moving in. Opportunities, resources, connections, ideas that were always present in your environment but invisible to your Murphy filter now begin appearing in your conscious awareness. And the neural pathway of helplessness, the one worn deep by repeated past failure, begins to compete with a new pathway. The pathway of a person who moves despite fear, who starts despite uncertainty, who acts despite the memory of what happened last time.
Every time you take that step, even imperfectly, even incompletely, even with your heart pounding and your brain screaming that this is probably going to hurt, you make that new pathway slightly stronger and the old one slightly weaker. Now, how do you actually take that first step when everything in you is saying, wait? The science gives us a very specific answer. You make the step small enough that your brain cannot logically refuse it. Not the whole task, not the whole goal, not the whole project that feels overwhelming and uncertain and risky. One sentence of the email, 2 minutes of the workout, one paragraph of the document, one call you have been avoiding.
Neuroscientist B.J. Fogg at Stanford University calls this tiny habits, the practice of anchoring a new behavior to something so small that the brain's threat detection system does not have enough to object to. The resistance is designed for big, scary starts. It is not built to stop you from writing one sentence. Write the sentence, make the call, take the 2-minute walk, and then let Newton's law take over. Because once you are in motion, Yhprum's law activates. Everything that can work starts working.
Now, I want to address something directly, because everything I have said so far might sound straightforward in theory and genuinely difficult in practice. Especially when things are not just uncertain, when things are actually falling apart, when the business is struggling, when the relationship is breaking, when the health news is bad, when the financial situation is genuinely serious, when every external signal is pointing toward Murphy, and you are supposed to find Yhprum somewhere in the middle of all of that. Is optimism still the answer then? The research says yes, but not in the way that word is usually used. Optimism, genuine, evidence-based, neurologically grounded optimism, is not the belief that everything will be fine. It is the belief that you are capable of responding to whatever happens. It is not denial. It is not pretending the difficulty does not exist. It is not performing positivity for an audience while quietly falling apart.
Fredrickson's research showed that positive emotions do not eliminate negative ones. They broaden the range of thoughts and actions available to us alongside them. In other words, you can hold genuine difficulty and genuine possibility at the same time. And the brain that can do that can acknowledge the reality of a hard situation while remaining open to the possibility of a way through it, consistently outperforms the brain that can only see one or the other. The person who stays genuinely optimistic through real difficulty is not someone who cannot see the problem. They are someone who refuses to let the problem become the only thing they can see. And that refusal, that deliberate, practiced, neurologically trained refusal, is what keeps the RAS filter open to the 50 bits per second that contain the way forward.
The Murphy brain, in a genuinely hard situation, sees only evidence that confirms the difficulty. The Yhprum brain, in the exact same situation, sees the difficulty clearly and keeps its filter open for the thing it has not seen yet. That opening is where everything changes. Now I want to share something that is not from a research paper, it is not from a study, it is not from a verified psychological framework. It is something I believe, genuinely, from reflection and from paying attention to how life actually moves. And I want to say it directly, because I think it is the most important thing in this entire video. Water that moves stays clean, stays fresh, stays alive, stays capable of sustaining everything around it. Water that stops moving becomes stagnant, still, heavy, a place where nothing good can grow and nothing alive can thrive. Your life works exactly the same way. Not as a metaphor for hustle culture, not as a demand to be constantly productive or constantly achieving or constantly moving towards some external goal, but as a fundamental truth about the nature of energy, of momentum, of what happens to a human being who chooses forward motion, even imperfect, uncertain, frightened forward motion, over the false safety of staying still.
There will be times, many times, perhaps more times than feel fair, when everything around you seems to be going wrong, when the situations are not aligning, when the results are not arriving, when the plan is not working and the effort feels wasted, and the gap between where you are and where you want to be feels wider than when you started. In those moments, your brain will offer you a very convincing argument for stopping. It will dress that argument in the language of wisdom, of self-protection, of being realistic,
of not setting yourself up for more disappointment. I want you to hear that argument clearly, and then keep moving anyway. Not because movement guarantees arrival, not because optimism is a magic formula that bypasses difficulty, but because the alternative, stopping, waiting, becoming still, does not protect you from difficulty. It just makes you face the difficulty without momentum, without the dopamine of anticipation, without the RAS filter open to possibility, without the neural pathway of action growing stronger with every step you take. You have to rewire yourself toward forward motion before anyone or anything outside you can confirm that you were right to keep going. The confirmation comes after you move, not before. And here's what life has taught me about people who find their way through genuinely hard things. They were not more talented. They were not more certain. They were not less afraid. They were just moving. Slowly sometimes. Imperfectly always. With doubt as a constant companion and clarity as an occasional visitor. But moving. And moving water stays alive. So does the person who chooses, again and again and again, in small moments that nobody witnesses and nobody celebrates, to take the next step anyway.
So let me bring all of this together for you now. Why has your brain been refusing to start? Not because you are lazy, not because you do not want it badly enough, not because you are fundamentally different from the people who seem to just go. Because your brain learned from what happened last time. It filed the experience of trying and hurting and built a neural pathway designed to protect you from going through that again. That is not a character flaw. That is a compassionate, intelligent, deeply misguided act of self-protection. Why does Murphy's Law feel more true than Yhprum's Law? Because your reticular activating system has been trained by experience, by repetition, by the weight of previous disappointment, to filter for evidence that confirms what it already believes. And it finds that evidence because it is looking for it. In a room full of both obstacles and openings, it shows you the obstacles.
What does Yhprum's law of action actually mean? It means that everything that can work will work. And it shows up the moment you move. Not when you are ready, not when the conditions are perfect, not when the fear has passed or the doubt has cleared or the memory of last time has faded. The moment you move. And how do you stay in motion when everything is falling apart? You choose the Yhprum filter. Deliberately, imperfectly, one moment at a time. You make the step small enough that your brain cannot refuse it. You acknowledge the difficulty honestly and keep the filter open for the way through anyway. You remember that water that moves stays alive, and you move. Not because the outcome is guaranteed, but because the only version of you that finds the outcome is the one who was moving when it arrived. If something in this video shifted something for you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Not for the algorithm, but because someone you know is lying on the floor of that shuttle box right now, convinced that effort is pointless, that things do not work out for people like them, that tomorrow is safer than today. And they deserve to know that the exit is right there. They just need someone to show them it is possible to jump.
Subscribe to Why You Did That. Every single week, we go this deep into the real reasons behind the things you feel, the choices you make, and the patterns you cannot seem to escape. Real psychology, real neuroscience, explained like a conversation, not a lecture. Your next video is already waiting. I will see you there.